of the open lecture series with President Ilves that is going to discuss the various issues around digitization, about politics, and how it actually impacts and maybe changes democracy and politics. And we expect quite a broad, different crowd that is participating. We have laid it out in actually 2 parts of the presentation, and so we'll have a short break in between. Please note that this lecture series is part of our master's program on politics and governance in the digital age. And we're curious to hear how we're going forward and all the insights that we'll be getting. Please note that we will record this lecture series. So in case you do not want to appear with your video, please keep the video off or don't speak up. Other than that, we want you to actually put your questions in the chat so that you prepare already for the Q&A session, which we will have as part of this lecture series. And you can also put your hands up in case you would like to actually also raise your question in person. And without further ado, dear President, dear Toomas, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, yes,
please start the recording, Ellis.
All right. So, I mean, where I left off last time, we were talking about the issues confronting living in a modern society where, in fact, everything is becoming digital except for public services and governance. So we have tools, we know, if we look at the private sector, to do amazing things. And then we have, in most countries, you're still dealing with paper. So the question is, how do you build a digital democracy? And basically, to just give you advance warning, I will talk about the fundamentals you have to do. I will not talk about specific technologies, but certain principles that you need to follow, and associated with that, at least what it is that Estonia has done. You don't really need to do the exact same, you don't need at all to do the exact same thing, but if you want security, you need to, digitizing government, you need to fulfill certain requirements, and I will explain how we do it. So how do you build a digital democracy? We now have tools that didn't exist before, but we know it's not a matter of technology. The question is, how do you do this politically? I mean, there are actually 2 political problems. One is politically, you have to get governments to do it. And as we know, take the United States or Germany, 2 of the richest countries in the world, that in fact, at the governmental level have not proceeded with this. And then the other side, which is that you can the government can actually decide it's going to do something, but you also need to achieve use by people. And this is another problem that you will face, that what do you do if you have all these services or you have good services, but which no one uses? So what is the social contract you need? Well, it's maybe a little more technical than the one of Rousseau or Locke. But on the other hand, how do you redo governance, which is absolutely necessary after when bureaucracy was a serial or sequential process with a document going from one office to another. So the reason why, what it really comes down to is trust. If you have you over your lifetime come to trust the operation of the government? And in the case of lots of countries, which did not go through things like Soviet invasions, occupation, people have grown up in democracies, and they believe in paper because it provides something that is real. You get a receipt that you have been on paper. In the government apparatus, you sign for a document, and but I would argue that we don't believe this in the digital world is more or less a psychological bias. And that's what is missing, is that ineffable thing called trust. So in fact, you have to build trust. You have to get people to the point where citizens are willing to use the system. And if there is no trust, there will be no uptake by the population. So trust is the sine qua non underlying everything in digitization. Though I would say at the same time, the gullibility and willingness of people to completely give up trust in the private sector is beyond me. I mean, you have this curious situation in which people, far more secure systems than any online purchases, are doubted by the public, whereas you will go on any kind of website and say, oh, gee, here's my credit card, and this is what I'll give it to you, and then I hope I get a product, and then you might find out that your credit card has been used for all kinds of things. So the first thing, I mean, if you look at what provides trust, before we even get into the really technical things, is that you need transparency. I mean, this is, since you're not going to have a piece of paper that shows something, you're going to have to deal with the issue of, how do I know what's going on? Can I see these processes? I can have a piece of paper that proves something, but digital stuff, I don't know. Well, the issue that I think the way to do this is through transparency. That who can look at your data, what is legitimate to look at, where can I find my own data, who is the person that is looking at your data. And you can begin to build trust in a way that citizens are willing to use the system. And you need to do things such as defining who can look at your data, who can look at a citizen's data. Rushing to go out to buy some kind of solution will not resolve the legal and regulatory issues that inevitably arise whenever you have a digitized governance. And those are the real issues on which trust in the system and its use will depend. But the country cannot treat this merely as a legal or regulatory issue. What culturally is acceptable to make public, to have online, to not have online also varies. And so we in Northern Europe tend more to favor transparency, and hence consider such things as property ownership, public information. In Europe, this is an absolute taboo. No one can know what you own, and as I mentioned last time, to the point that how much money you get from, say, the European Union, even though it's not your money, it's the money of the people living in Europe, but no one can know that you as Danone or Nestle get billions and billions from the Common Agricultural Program, because that violates your privacy, but in any case, we don't. You have to resolve these issues basically on what your culture is willing to accept. But more basically, trust is based on your identity, how secure your identity is, and its uniqueness. You want it to be that no one can impersonate you, that no one can change your data, that online only you are you. And if you could put up just the slide, and I don't know what size it will be, the first one that says slide 1. And this is a classic computer. There it is. The fundamental issue anywhere and always has been, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. This is the fundamental identity issue. This is a 1993 cartoon or from the New Yorker. So it's 28 years old. It has not changed since then. This remains the fundamental issue. If, for as long as we're dealing with analog governance, you're going to prove your identity by going to an office. You're going to show your ID. You're going to show a driver's license. And this will, and you, since you're there, it has a picture. You know, you look like you, more or less. And then the official there says, "Oh, you are you. Great. Okay, now you get to do this." Now, when we go back to the digital world, or when we go to the digital world, we have to solve this problem that of a unique and secure identity. So what we have done in Estonia, and what basically everyone has to do if you're going to achieve any kind of digitization, and which is the first step, which is utterly impossible in the United States, because there seems to be some kind of strange psychological objection to this. But you need a secure and digital identity for every resident of your country. Anyone who lives in your country must have a digital identity, and it must be unique. No one else should be able to have that identity. And if you think about it, well, that's what you have to do, that it is a trusted identity. I mean, it seems kind of, if you're Estonian, and you know, if you're basically under 36 at this time, I would say. I mean, basically, if you were an adult before, a reasonable adult before the development of an ID card, even a non-digital one, basically, it's not an issue for us. But when I talk to other countries, they go, "Why? We have to have do we really need an identity?" And the problem is, yes, you do need an identity. And so step number one, you need a secure, unique identity, and I'll explain what is entailed in that in a minute. A government that really wants to have a serious digital government, form of government, has to think about more about services that people want, not services that make the life of the Ministry of Finance easier in order to collect taxes. I mean, you do that too, but if you want to digitize government, and this is again a place where many countries kind of go in the wrong direction, is that you have a digitization program for the government, not a digitization program for the citizens. Third element, which I would say you need, is you need an architecture of this whole system that is based on, is legally founded and grounded, and is also based on the cultural norms of where you are and the people that you are serving. But more important is that you need something, I would argue, and this is one reason why, at least psychologically, Estonia has the Estonian public has the trust that it does in the system, and that elsewhere it doesn't exist, is that you need mutual reciprocal transparency. What do I mean by that? It means that I can see who is looking at my data. I mean, at least those data, I mean, who's looking at those data they're allowed to look at. And you also, the other side of this is there are data such as your health records that no one can look at besides you and your doctor, but you can certainly find out who's been looking at your property records. And the final element which you need to address is rarely addressed in these discussions, because no one gets beyond sort of yelling privacy, 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 is actually the genuine interest, genuine issue, which is data integrity. And data integrity is really, I would argue, from now until until we're all wiped out by electromagnetic pulse or something, is that data integrity means that data cannot be changed without it being authorized. And so because we've solved these problems, this is why we have had no breaches other than one kind of exception, which are insider breaks, which I will mention briefly later, but we have guaranteed against that as well. The solutions are technological, and this is why today will be a little bit technical, but the technology will be changed as technology advances. The issues remain identical. So whatever technology is used, then we will see big changes in technology in the next several years. The same issues must be addressed. All right, the first issue is identity. And what is a secure digital identity? It belongs to one person. It is only one person. It is unique. It cannot be duplicated. It cannot be forged. As opposed to the classic New Yorker cartoon that I showed you a minute ago with the one dog saying on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, digital governance cannot work without secure identity. And funny as the joke was 28 years ago, this is the fundamental problem of any interaction that is not face-to-face. You do not know with whom you are dealing. Is it the government dealing with you over the computer? Or is it someone impersonating you? Are you as a user dealing with a public service or your bank or some entity pretending to be a government, a bank, or a credit card company? I mean, one of the most common forms of computer fraud is accessing by some means your connection to the bank, or now this is kind of decreased because banks have gotten smarter, but you would have these, you'd get these spear phishing attacks. Your bank, you need to change your bank account number. Enter here your name and your password, and then change your password. So in the process, and so, well, when this happens, you do this, but you're not really dealing with your bank, you're dealing with someone that looks like your bank on a web page. And there again, you're dealing with the same issue. You do not know the identity of the entity you are speaking with. So basically what we did to solve this fundamental problem is that everyone in Estonia is issued a unique, secure digital identity used to access all government services, be they health records, automobile registration, taxes, social services, property records, a myriad of private sector services, because they are because they have decided that they need a secure system. Wait, let me just check here. What do we got here? So what we do to make sure you are you is a series of steps or a series of technological solutions. The first one is it's not enough to have an email address and a password. Any single password you can ultimately break. I mean, if they're really long and complicated, then it'll take a really long time to do it. And that's why you have all these sort of password programs that give you all these 12-digit uppercase, lowercase, characters, dashes, all kinds of things. I mean, that just makes it very hard. But basically, the way to at this point in the development of technology, and only for the next several years, I would argue, is you need something called two-factor authentication. And if you put on the next slide, you will see what I mean by two-factor authentication. This is the conceptual view of it. You see that you have something that is in your possession, and you know something that is in your, you know something. So this, and you see in real life, if you're Estonian, when you do anything on relating to the government, where you use your ID card, and if you're not in Estonia, then you use anytime in Europe, at least, if not, but not necessarily the United States, where you use a chip credit card, because you put your card into the little machine, and the chip says, okay, here I am, I'm a chip. And then you put in what you know, and that what you know is your PIN number. And if the PIN number is your unique PIN number and is your unique chip, and if they match up, then the chances are pretty good you are you. And we use that as the basis of all connections to the government or to any government services. I mean, as I said, and you do the same thing when you use a credit card. I mean, the U.S. is only now going over to chip-based cards, and I mean, it's doing it fairly quickly, I guess. But it is also the case that when Americans would come to Europe for the past 20 years, and America used these magnetic little strips that you would slide through through a credit card reader. And of course, those didn't work here at all because they don't allow you to have two-factor authentication, which is, as I mentioned, the sine qua non for getting anything done. But since then, I mean, that's one, I mean, using a chip on a card is how we started off in the beginning. But we moved quickly on to phone options. We came up, let's face it, your phone works on a chip. And so you program the chip to in fact, do what your chip card does. That's kind of a no-brainer. And then from there on in, we have moved to more complex systems, but you have to go and take a series of steps to make your phone something to use on as a mobile ID, all again, basically using the chip in your card. But the main point of all of this is to make sure you have an identity that is provable at a distance, and the matchup takes place in your device. Just as when you pay with a credit card, with a touch card, basically it matches you up. That card is yours, and if it goes over a certain sum that you're buying, you also type in an ID, because they're willing to lose 30 bucks or 30 euros, but nothing really more than that. So that's the one step. The second step that you need to deal with is make sure that the entire pathway from your device, from your computer plus chip or ID or your phone to where you're going is encrypted. And encryption really is the thing that really makes all of this work in countries that digitize. And if the entire system is not fully encrypted, it won't work. It just will, I mean, it will be broken. And so what we use, and what is basically used by any kind of entity worried about security, is we use end-to-end encryption. That means from your device to wherever you're going, everything in between is encrypted in a way that is unbreakable at this point in time. I stress that because the system we use, which is called public key infrastructure, which is a mathematical encryption model so unbreakable now that the U.S. National Security Agency, or NSA, tried to ban its publication in a scientific journal. I mean, this is something is so powerful. It is a mathematical model, and it was going to be published in a mathematics journal. And the NSA in the United States saw this and realized what it meant, and it tried to censor the article. And it was a huge court case in the United States, going, what are you going to do? Ban mathematical formula? Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. lost, but what it meant is something that revolutionized all of the science of it, digitization. And in fact, the two authors of this idea both live in Stanford and are there today, Hal Murray and Dilthey, what's his name? Dilthey. And I actually suggested they get a prize for this from the Estonian president, my successor, because without this, we would never have become a digitized country, nor would anything else have become, anything serious become digitized. But what I would ask you to show now is what I guess is the video, the first video, which I hope is right. I have two videos. It's a very short video. Nope, that's the wrong one. Sorry. That one. Yes.
PKI is a two-key asymmetric cryptosystem. It is a framework that allows different IT systems to have high level of information confidentiality through strong data encryption and high level of confidence through authentication with digital signatures and digital certificates. Let's say that Bob wants to send a secure message to Mary. Mary has a key pair that consists of the public key and the private key. These keys are statistically unique and mathematically related, yet they are different from one another. Bob requests Mary's public key. It's public, which means it can be distributed to anyone who wants to send an encrypted message to Mary. It also means that the key is not a secret and therefore doesn't require any special protection. So Mary sends it to Bob. Then Bob uses the public key that Mary sends him to encrypt a message, and he sends the message back. Anything encrypted with the public key cannot be decrypted with the same key. It has to be decrypted with the corresponding private key, which is kept secret. So Mary uses her private key to decrypt the message and read it. This is great for confidentiality. Anyone who intercepted that message cannot decrypt the message because they don't have Mary's private key. But how do we really know that Bob really got Mary's public? Someone could have pretended to be Mary and sent Bob her public key. The solution seems incomplete. This is where digital certificates come in. Digital certificates are data packages that identifies the entity, in this case person, that is associated with a public key. The digital certificate itself is protected by asymmetric cryptography. A trusted party known as a certificate authority, or CA for short, issues these digital certificates to the person once a certain confidence in the person's identity has been established by the CA. PKI is also often backed up by legislation that is country-specific. You might find PKI mentioned in the Digital Signatures Act, Electronic Transactions Act, or Electronic Commerce Act, etc. of your own country. A CA is both an organization as well as a set of IT systems that is responsible for issuing, revoking, and distributing digital certificates. It is often a third-party organization that is trusted by all parties participating in the PKI. However, organizations can also have their own in-house CA system. SecureMetrics PKI in a Box appliance allows organizations to do exactly that with ease and at a lower cost. Let's look at the Bob-Mary scenario again, but this time with PKI. Bob wants to send a secret message to Mary. Mary has already obtained a digital certificate from a CA that Bob trusts. Bob can now either get Mary's certificate from the CA, from Mary herself, or from anybody else who has Mary's certificate. Since the digital certificate can be independently verified, it doesn't really matter where Bob gets Mary's certificate from. The digital certificate contains Mary's particulars, public key, the CA's particulars, and cryptographic data. All the information needed to identify the entity with a high level of confidence. The message itself is encrypted and decrypted in the same way. But this time, Bob makes sure that the public key came from Mary by validating the digital certificate. How does one validate a digital certificate? Well, that's a story for another time. Contact SecureMetrics PKI expert now, and they would be glad to tell you more about PKI over lunch.
Okay. Now, I said we would be slightly technical today. In the case of Estonia, certificates for any interactions with the government are issued by a certification authority, which we set up in 2000, which does precisely what that video showed, which said, "You are you, and the person talking to you is who he or she says they are." And you, in fact, can also, we offer as an ancillary service, you can also write yourself completely encrypted messages. But that's, I mean, basically what matters is that your communications are encrypted. So when I want to go into my health records or change my car registration, I do all of that directly, but in fact, it is encrypted from end to end. I never see the fact that it's encrypted, but it allows us to have a secure system and to build trust in the way the government operates. And this is something that has been crucial to us for all these years. If you want to read more about it, Google public key infrastructure. You can also Google two-factor authentication, and you can read to whatever level of mathematical or otherwise sophistication you're interested in. For the purposes of this lecture series, that's all you need to know, is that those are the two elements that guarantee you are you and allow you to perform all the things that with complete and utter trust that you will hear for the next decades about. But what about privacy? What happens if someone hacks into it? You can say 2FA, two-factor authentication, PKI, public key infrastructure, and you will dazzle them with your knowledge, and also say, in other words, unless you understand what I'm talking about when I say PKI and 2FA, you have no reason or no right to ask about any issues about privacy. We might want to throw in an E2E, which stands for end-to-end encryption, which is also part of the process that uses PKI and 2FA. You will also sound like an utter geek if you would just go around saying 2FA, PKI, E2E, but nonetheless, you need to, those will solve the problems that will be raised by 95% of the people who have any issues with digital governance. Now, having an identity that is secure leads to a difficult political decision. I mean, there are lots of political decisions in this, and as I said, you need as the video also said, you need the government, you need the parliament to pass a digital signature law, which is absolutely vital, because that means that if Then once you have an identity, if you can prove your identity digitally, you might as well take the next step and allow digital signatures. And this is, again, really what makes digital governance work, because you no longer need what are called in the business wet signatures. In fact, there was no concept of a wet signature before we had digital signatures, because all signatures were on paper with a pen. But today we have digital signatures, so then they invented the term wet signatures for the old kind of signatures. But basically, you can just imagine, unless you grew up in Estonia, you can imagine what a mess, how much you have to sign for everything. This is the basis of the US check system, right? People still use checks in the United States. And then you have to take that piece of paper and then you have to go to the bank. These are all the kinds of problems that you deal with. Are there Americans here on this thing? I doubt it, probably not. But you're not in America.
No, I'm here in Estonia.
Okay, but you still have, but you know checks, right? Estonians have no clue what checks are until they move to the United States or Canada. They're this ancient technology that people use in certain countries in the world.
Perhaps a funny story about this. A friend of mine recently received a check from the American tax services. Well, when I say recently, I mean already about a year ago. And the closest place where she can actually cash it in is apparently in Riga. Because there's just no way to even cash it in anymore in Estonia because it's just so antiquated.
I see you haven't moved in a month. Wouter, however you pronounce your name.
Just a second. Yeah, I forgot to turn it on.
Okay, so congratulations on your move.
Thank you.
All right, where am I? What time is it? Or how are we doing on time?
We are, 40 minutes.
Okay, I'll go on. Okay, I'll speed it up because otherwise I'll never get to the really awful stuff. All right, but so you have to make a political decision now. And this is again another point where countries screw up in a big way, which is that you have to make digital identities mandatory. EU countries are, it took 17 years from when we brought in mandatory digital identities until the European Union passed a regulation or directive, sorry, or maybe it's a regulation, anyway, that mandated governments to offer digital identities to their citizens. That is, that you didn't need one, but governments in the European Union had to offer digital identities. And it wasn't until COVID and COVID last year that Greece finally found the way to overcome the unwillingness of much of the government and to actually offer citizens digital identity. So they didn't have them until then. The problem was that you had such big opposition to any kind of IDs that digital identities from major forces in society. In the case of Greece, it was the Greek Orthodox Church, but to actually offer this thing. Now, this is part of the problem is it's never enough, and this is the political decision, it's never enough to simply offer digital identities because basically most people won't bother getting them because you have a chicken and egg, or as we say in Estonian, nokkinni savalahti, it's like a bird who gets his beak stuck in tar and then pulls it out and then his tail is stuck in the tar, is that you must make them mandatory so that there is a reason for the government agencies to invest the considerable sums needed to develop digital services. Because if you look at it, just think about it, you're a government agency and you're all paper-based, right? And then you say, well, I know I would save money if I digitize, but there's no reason to digitize because people don't have IDs. So, and if you, on the other hand, if you're a citizen, you're not going to be, and it's voluntary, you're not going to bother getting yourself a digital identity unless you get unless it gives you something, like, you know, the convenience of doing business with the government on your computer rather than going to the big crowded COVID-filled office where you're going to get sick. Well, I mean, this is all pre-COVID, obviously, but it becomes exceptionally important in this era. And this is also the reason why the Greek government finally succeeded. It was because everyone did everything in big government offices and they were waiting lines and all kinds of things. And they finally said, look, if you get a digital identity, you can stay at home and not go anywhere. But the point is that unless you do this, unless you make it mandatory, it won't work. You need to get a big enough up, you need to have lots of people. We don't know, maybe Christian Vassil will someday study this issue, but how many people, what percentage of society needs a digital identity in their possession for digitization to work? But government agencies will not undertake the considerable effort and labor needed to digitize a government service unless you have everyone digitized. I mean, government agencies, such as we have discovered in this country, will not take the effort necessarily to digitize, even if everyone has a digital identity. That's, I mean, it's, but at least if, I mean, they would never do anything if there were a, I mean, if there weren't mandatory digital identities. But as I said, it's not enough because as we discovered, there are agencies, even in Estonia, that don't want to deal with digitization, even when all the preconditions are there for it. So in any case, in most EU countries, digital IDs are voluntary and optional, and as a result, the uptake rates are slow. Typically 20 to 25% of the population possess a digital identity in countries where they are not mandatory. So as a result, there's no incentive for either government agencies or the private sector to invest in developing digital services. Because if 25% have a digital identity, then 75% do not have a digital identity. And that proportion of the population will therefore continue to demand and require analog paper-based services and a human staff to process their applications and needs. Nor will the private sector opt to undertake the investments required to offer digital services when a cost-benefit analysis shows minimal savings for the investment required to digitize services that are only used by some people. So as we, in English, a catch-22, chicken and egg, whatever you want. Without enough users, no incentive to develop services. Without services, there's no incentive for citizens to get digital identity. And so you need political will to cut the Gordian knot. And so you have to take this political risk to say, okay, everyone must have a digital identity. And that's where governments falter, because it's not simply a matter of tech, as I repeatedly say throughout this series. It's political and legal, and if you don't have the courage to do that as a government, you will remain in the paper era. It's 10 to 11. Maybe we should take a break at this point if you want. If you don't, I can continue. I just thought this kind of a logical place to break.
I think that would be a good idea, some 5 minutes.
All right. So the last part was about the issue of identity, and that being, I mean, a secure identity available to all, and in fact mandatory for all, is the basis of any successful digital system. The next thing is, how do you put it all together? I mean, how is it these things work? And this is what we call the problem of architecture. Now, if the last part is something that basically you can use, you really don't have much choice these days in terms of what you need to do. Now, when we get into the architecture, how does something like this work? Here, there are so many different models, and I will describe one kind of model, which is the one used in Estonia, which basically is the best so far until someone comes up with a better one. And we're waiting. I mean, there are problems with the architecture that we use, which I'll mention at the end. But the point is that all good models work like this at this point. So the question is, how do you access the services that you have with a secure identity? Well, obviously, the architecture must be secure. That is, that when I say the architecture, the Ministry of Health, the Motor Vehicle Bureau, property records, healthcare records, banking, all of that must at all times be safe and secure. And using the end-to-end encryption two-factor authentication model that I described before, actually all of these entities are securely connected. So we've solved that. But the next problem is what happens if someone does get in? And this has been a problem all over the world, that the architecture has not been thought out in two ways. One is the worst case still of mass stupidity of government digitization is the OPM hack in the United States, the Office of Personnel Management, where probably the Chinese, but no one's certain, but most likely the Chinese managed to steal the personnel records of 23 million US current and past employees of the federal government, including the psychological profiles and tests of CIA agents, the addresses of everyone who's ever worked in the United States government, be the Forest Service or the National Security Agency. And they did this because, first of all of the data were in clear text, not encrypted. But on top of that, the big issue was that all of the data were in a single database, one big database. So once you got in, you could take everything. And this took place in 2015. Now, the architecture we have is, there is no central database, or more technically, we have a distributed data exchange layer. And what that means is that all our data are in different places, some of it in the cloud, some of it in the ministries. This keeps changing. But in order to get anywhere, they're stored in different places, and you have to go there. And that actually the government takes care of for you. So you go into the government, you are verified or authenticated rather by this central server or center that says you are you, yes. And then that permits you to go on to where you want to go. But now I want to go look at my medical records or my prescriptions or whatever it is. And I go there. But the data are not in one big place, which gives you a huge advantage of insecurity, because you've already limited what people can get. Now, the idea of this, to understand why it's in terms of security, is the slide that I just sent to Jaak and Ellis. And you can just show that for a second. I mean, it's not a long thing. But conceptually, the idea is, if you some of you may recall that about 25, no, that one there, yeah. That about 25 years ago, the world's worst oil spill took place when the world's largest tanker, the Exxon Valdez, ran aground in Alaska. And it was such a big ship that they knew 20 miles or almost 30 kilometers from when they were going to go and crash, that they couldn't turn the ship enough to avoid the crash. And the problem with why you had such a huge, nasty effect was that oil tanker and oil tankers in the past had all of the oil sloshing around in it, all of it. And after that, they decided, okay, maybe we should have separate holds. So if you actually lose something, you will only lose it from here on the, say, hold number 3, and then you lose your losses are much smaller. Anyway, back to, okay, get rid of that. So what we have, we just designed a system about 21, 22 years ago using our own software, Linux-based, so it's not proprietary. Anyone can get it and use it and develop it. So what we did was we set up a system in the architecture. Since secure communication is too unwieldy and expensive for every government agency, that the government takes care of it. And then the ministries, agencies, and banks keep their data in their own servers, but you can access the data through the government portal where your identity is authenticated. And this is true even if you sit in right next to the server in a ministry, but more likely these days they're in a government cloud. But they are compartmentalized. So if there's a breach, the other data are secure. So this is the model the fundamental model we use in Estonia. And then we have a single gateway that certifies the user's identity. And this is all done by a certification center. Remember in the previous video on secure communication, that there's an agency that issues a certificate to everyone, both to what you're trying to access and also for you. And so we have a certification authority. Until recently, it was a 50-50 public, privately owned system where a consortium of banks, who are the biggest users of digital identity or of the digital identity service, and 50% was owned by the banks. And the banks, the government owns 50%. The digital society, the biggest users are, in fact, the banks on a daily basis. And so we have this system that is completely distributed. And what I'm going to ask you to look at is a very short video on the Estonian system, and which has now been adopted in part in Finland, in part in Panama, in part in Moldova, not so well there, but very exceedingly well in Iceland and in the Faroe Islands, and because it is probably the best model at this point. It's a short 3-minute video. Just roll it.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the Unemployment Insurance Fund depends on information from the Health Information System. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. They can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
Okay. Now, that was a fairly statist view in terms of how great it is for the state. From my point of view, the last part is actually what is the best part. It's the demand side, what the public wants. I talked to the guy who actually was designed part of X-Road. There are a lot of people involved in this, and the company or the people who designed it are angry to this day that the Estonian government bought it and then just gave it away. Since it's open source, we give this away as foreign aid, right? Not too many. We don't make any money off it. It became sort of owned by the state, even though it's non-proprietary software. But in any case, one of the guys designing it had just had a kid born, and in 2000 or 1999. And it was such a mess because first the kid was born, he had to go get a birth certificate for the kid on paper. Then he had to go and sign up for medical care. He had to go register the kid in the town that he lived in, because then you get municipal services and all this stuff he had to do. So when he designed, he said, for my next kid, I never want to do this again. So he designed a system so that, and the way it works in Estonia is that when a kid is born, in fact, the hospital informs the population board that the kid has been born. The only place where you do anything is the hospital says, what's his or her name? And then it says, on this day, this kid was born and this time, and it goes to the population board, which automatically issues a identity number for him, which later on you can turn into an identity document. And it informs the health whatever service that we have this new citizen and this person, this name, this number, and then you get health insurance and you can go to a doctor. And in fact, you're even assigned a local pediatrician if you want. You can pick another one. And on and on and on. So he solved his personal frustration by building this into the system. And since then, of course, all kinds of other things have been added to make life easier for the citizen. But that is the goal of governance, is to make life simpler for the citizen. Well, it does make life easier if done right for the government as well, and it cuts back on a lot of bureaucracy. But nonetheless, when I said in the beginning of this today that, you know, one of the big mistakes is to make things merely convenient for the government and not the citizen, that is that usually is a source of failure. Now, all of this is not, again, is not as easy as it sounds, because in fact, as with the case that I mentioned of designing it to make things easier for a birth, the question is, how do you connect the various ministries and the agencies and the citizen? The question is, connecting is easy. The question is what you should connect. How do you decide what gets connected to what, and who can see what you can access? I mean, who is permitted to see data? I mean, the data is all technologically, I mean, when you're designing it, you have to think that, well, you can actually go allow anyone to look at anything, but that it must conform to the country's laws, and it must conform to the country's, as I mentioned earlier, cultural understanding. Which agency can see tax records? What can the police see? What would you allow the police to see? In one country, some not so nice countries, the police can see everything about you. In this country, the police can see very little about you, other than that you have a busted taillight you haven't replaced, or that you have a speeding ticket you haven't paid for. But then again, there is the completely public information and then the strictly private information. This is not a trivial problem to solve, for it means designing and connecting all the various public and private entities in correspondence to the nation's laws. And this is a very time-consuming task, and it took about 8 or 9 years for us to actually get all of this. Now I'm going to have to speed up. All right. This is where you build in the factor that you can always see who's been looking at your data. This provides the mutual transparency that in reciprocal transparency that builds trust into the system. And so I can see who's been looking at my public data. I mean, they can't see my private data anyway. They can't see my medical records, but certainly they can see my public data, what I own, and so forth. And so you get to see it. So the other rate determining factor here will be how quickly ministries and agencies that have always kept their data in paper form can digitize them so that they are available for various services. And that takes time. You need, in order to turn paper government into digital government, you have to digitize the data that you have. On the other hand, what this the digital distributed digital exchange system allows is probably one of the most convenient aspects of digitization, and what, in fact, reduces dramatically the amount of time spent on government and its cost and its convenience is the once only rule. As you saw from that video, you have different data are stored in different places. You do not, with this system, have to tell them things that they already know, that they have somewhere in their system. So if I want, when I log on with my ID card, the system does not ask me for my address, for my phone number. All those data exist somewhere in the system, and according to my unique identification, those can be pulled in together. So if you're in a country that is not digitized, every time you interact with the government, you have to write your name, address, telephone number, address, all of that stuff that you have to put somewhere. Which takes an enormous amount of time in the aggregate. Anyone who's ever lived in that kind of system has probably spent significant part of their life, at least a week, I would say, writing out their name, address, phone number, or whatever other information the government asks you for a form. You don't do that here because that government exists. All you need to do is identify yourself by authenticating yourself with your card or with your phone. And so so we may not be asked any information. When I get my tax form, it's all filled out. My kids, how much I paid, how much I donated, how much I made. That makes life easier. Finally, let me get to, in the 8 minutes I have before we go over to Q&A, is the issue of privacy and data integrity. When we talk about digitized government, everyone goes nuts about, privacy, privacy, privacy. And in fact, as I continually have tried to stress here, you are more private and secure than you are in any paper system. Because paper systems, paper files, someone can go and look at your files. They can make photocopies of it. You can do what happened. You can do what happened to Michael Schumacher, the racing car driver, when he crashed in 2013. Within hours of his horrible accident, all of his X-rays and his pictures and all the medical analyses were published in Bild Zeitung, the largest daily newspaper in Europe. And that is possible only with a paper system because someone went in there and took out the files and made a photocopy and then passed them on to Bild Zeitung. That cannot happen in this system because you would know exactly who went into his records. And so that is my argument, you have greater privacy with a digitized government than you do with the system that's used elsewhere these days. But what we miss in this discussion is not the issue of, is not the misguided privacy concerns, but rather the issue of data integrity. And data integrity, I think, is the real problem that we face and will always face from now on. And the more digitized we are, the more we will face the problem of data integrity. Now, data integrity is not that someone can see something. It's rather that someone can change something. If someone finds out my blood type or my medical records, okay, well, if someone finds out my bank account, rather meager, well, that could be embarrassing. Look how little money he has, ha, 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 ha. Or look how much money he has and he's only like this and what come he has so much money? All that is embarrassing. On the other hand, if someone changes my medical records, it can be very fatal. If someone changes my blood type and I'm taken to the hospital and they say, oh, he has this kind of blood, but I really don't. I have a different kind of blood because someone changed it in between, I would die. Most likely, if someone changed my bank account, it would not be to make it bigger. So those are integrity issues, whether data can be exchanged. It was briefly mentioned in that short video on Extra about, well, no one can come and change data, but integrity is really a big issue, and anything that is digitized has to worry about this. From a government point of view, what we have done in Estonia is that we no longer have any of our laws on paper. 5 minutes. All right, their laws are only in digital form. So can you imagine we have a law from, 2008, and suddenly, someone gets arrested for breaking this law. In the meantime, someone goes and changes the law that makes it no longer a crime. Well, we're in serious trouble in that case. Same thing with court cases. You have a court case and it's only available digitally. You can look it up, that's fine, no problem. But in fact, someone's gone in there and changed the result of a court case upon which a precedent has been set. And so with that, precedent ceases to be a precedent. We have to worry about these things. And for that reason, since 2008, not because of the court case, but just since 2008, because you can change data that data, once you become a digital state, can be changed. We have put everything that is of importance on blockchain. I will not talk about blockchain. I will simply say that it is not Bitcoin. Blockchain is used for Bitcoin, yes, but it's not a non-fungible token or any of those things. It is actually a permission blockchain, which means that in order to make any changes in it, it requires permission from a limited number of people. So it works very quickly. It is when blockchain in general is that you cannot change data that is on blockchain. I mean, it's there. You cannot go back and change something that happened in the past and it's called blockchain because it's built on a series of mathematical blocks. Anyway, the point is that you have to worry about data integrity a lot if you're going to go digital. And maybe next time I'll talk a little bit about it, but not too much because I want to move on to other subjects. But in any case, those are the key elements of a functioning digital system. You need not use the technology we use, but you have to solve the fundamental issue of identity, secure, and unique. You have to solve the issue of how you connect it all up, which we can call the architecture. And finally, you must ensure that you have data integrity. And with that, Q&A.
Wonderful. Okay, so what I would, before we go into the individual questions of the participants, I want to use this right for myself as the moderator for basically the backstage view. So, I mean, you talked about, on the one hand side, how e-governance is helping the administration, is helping the state institutions. And you said that it's not focusing enough on preparing the citizens for that. But I mean, I think we have a bit of an insight into how administrations digitize. We have a bit of an insight how the citizens do, but we have no clue how the decision makers are actually digitizing. So what was your experience when you did exactly this spiel that you just told us? You tried to tell that other leading personnel of various states. So what was your experience with that, and how digital were they already?
Well, I mean, it's pretty binary. If they have realized that, I mean, I can talk to Singapore and we have great discussions, and we talk about how you solve this and how it's all, as you would say, self-verständlich or self-evident.
Yeah.
And then you talk to other governments, and basically who you have, I mean, this is the sociology of all this. You basically have to really hope they have an influential person in a sufficiently high level to say, yes, that he makes sense. But if you talk to someone, I mean, most politicians, unfortunately, well, in Europe, their background is basically what we call political broilers in Estonia. They've made their careers strictly within a party and rarely know anything about anything else other than the party. Well, there's some other interesting cases. I had what I had a few times. I would go when I was in office every year to the UN, and I would always lots of requests for meetings from various heads of state and government from developing countries, and they would all say, "Oh, we hear you digitize and you did this and that." And I go, "Yeah." And I would say, well, one of the benefits of digitization is that you can't bribe a computer. Everything is transparent. And I kept saying you can't bribe a computer. And then Taavi Kotka, who accompanied me on these trips to sell the point, in case they had someone technical. And he said, "Ilves, stop saying that." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you're talking to the head of your counterpart," and he's nodding his head. We're looking at the rest of the staff. And as soon as you say you can't bribe a computer, these people go, "Oh, I see. All right. Well, maybe not." So digitization is not always something that governments want. And we can all think of a lot of governments that are not interested in transparency of transactions. And that are, in fact, don't want digitization because, in fact, you lose a source of income. And this is especially a problem on petty corruption, which is low-level corruption, where a very common problem in the developing world is to get any kind of government service, you have to pay a low-level official to get what you are entitled to anyway. I mean, this is kind of like, technically a non-discretionary decision. You are this age, you are a single mother, 4 kids, therefore the government will give you this much support, or something where basically the decision is not up to anybody other than you fill the criteria. When you're digitized, you can just do it online and you get whatever you're supposed to get, reductions in taxes or whatever it is you get. On the other hand, if you have to deal with a human intermediary working in a local office, that in many places is a source of corruption. You have to pay to get it. I mean, certainly we see this in post-communist countries, a lot of post-communist countries. I mean, you can read these horror stories about Russia all the time. I mean, basically to get you're in a hospital, you have to pay to get this and you have to pay that, all and so forth. So the reception is different. And then there are other problems,
So basically what you're saying is they need our graduates from the master program on politics and governance so that the heads of state actually know that it's actually a good thing. So to really understand this transformation process.
Yes, that's part of it. You do need to have people who can explain it to heads of state in more detail. And as I said, that's one element. On the other hand, if society is committed to, I'll tell you on this one more thing. Sometimes the political issues can be really fundamental that have little to do with the digitization, privacy, blah, 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 stuff that I talk about all the time. But, okay, you're a country that is not very rich, and you pay and you sustain the country by having lots of completely underpaid civil servants, and you count on the civil servants getting their income from taking small bribes. Now, you could completely disrupt the country by actually getting rid of civil servants, having to pay them more money. Suddenly you have lots of civil servants, former civil servants, who are not making money. And the only way you can do this really is to actually pay your civil servants more and to get rid of a lot of them. Now that's a big overhaul of society. In fact, that's often what when I'm asked about, well, how did you deal with all of this when you digitized? Because in fact, you needed fewer employees. Yeah, well, those are, I mean, that's a much bigger issue than, okay, well, do we use, you know, whatever, X-Road or do we use something else?
So great. So, I mean, actually, there is also this great Indian website, ipaythebride.com. Yeah, so that also where you can actually document that you had to pay something, or the other way around, I was bribed, and similarly around that. So that then I would like to go to the questions by our participants. So I would like to ask Nina Morel to start with a first question that is linking up to that part about the citizens. Nina, please.
Yes, hello, thank you. Yeah, I have a question about how the transition about the digitalization process works with, for example, older generation who don't have the habits of that, and also for people who don't have the financial resources to have access to all those digital things. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, this is, we've done this over basically about 22, 23 years, because we realized even before we started digitizing in this way, that in fact, rural populations, older populations don't get it necessarily. And so we had a program initially called See the World. And it was a tripartite program, NGOs, banks, and the government, to go around. This is, it's kind of like, you know, electrificatie in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. We went around with a bus, and I went along occasionally, even though I was like foreign minister, just to be there, you know. And we'd roll out like 80 computers and put them on tables, and then we'd come there, and we all had these. We had these NGO volunteers who would show people how to use a computer, you know. And it's so that was the initial attempt, and then part of that program was that we put in every municipality, in the municipal office, and then I mean, you know, you have a town office or village office, and we put a room in there with 10 computers, and someone who would be there to help you if you didn't want to. I mean, didn't know how to do it. You just didn't know how to do it. I mean, you're 70 years old and you see this thing and you go, "What the hell is this?" And then we had a staff person there, and this was supported most by the banks. And why? Because the banks used to have in every single village, they would have a brick and mortar bank office, which is expensive. You have to pay rent, you have to pay for staff. And so they said, well, it makes much more sense if we go over to digital banking. And this is again before X-Road and the ID and everything. Let's go over to digital banking. And so they provided funds for this. It was another public-private effort. And at least in the beginning, for the first 10 years, everywhere you would drive around Estonia, and there would be these signs that would have, I mean, the standard European, you know, 500 meters to a park or something. We had, you know, 200 meters to a public internet site, and it was, the symbol was a blue @ And they have these signs all over the country, less of them today, because the next step was, which we started doing in after, say, I don't know when the exact date was. It was well, pretty soon after that. All these municipal offices put up Wi-Fi, and I remember using this in 2006 when I was running for president. I needed to send off some document real fast. I was in like somewhere in the countryside. And so I said, okay, where's the nearest town? And so I drove there, and then it has Wi-Fi out. I mean, so I just stood by. I mean, I parked my car next to the office, and they had a public Wi-Fi thing. I mean, not that secure, but anyway, the point is that I could send my email off that way. Teaching people is a continual effort, but somehow it more or less works. I think there are two more aspects. One of them is that actually, as Estonia has progressed from being a rather poor country to one which is like already in the rich country category, today 90% of households in Estonia have a computer, either an iPad or a computer at home. So that has changed dramatically. I don't have the sociological, studies on why or how this happened. But if I look at computer ownership in 2000 was like really, really low, like almost non-existent. And now we've gotten in 20 years to about 90%. And I think part of this has to do with actually people invest in buying a computer or a laptop because it's very hard to do stuff without one these days. You always have the paper option, but people don't want the paper option. And so that's to understand in the United States, in the end of the 90s, only 36% of the population at the end of the 90s had a PC of any form in their house. And now in Estonia, 90% have a computer of some type, of some sort. Where the other problem that we have is in the low quality of user interfaces, which we just experienced as a problem with the past 2 weeks because the government or the health authorities sent out notification of vaccination via computer to a universal email system where every citizen, every person in the country that has an ID has an email address. It's a sort of, the problem with this email address is that you have to set it so that it also, if you send an email to this official email address, which most people don't use at all, it has to be forwarded to your real email address. And so they sent it to the official one, and people who had not put this, changed it to being forwarded to their real email address, didn't get the notification. This is a complete screw up by the ministry. But in order to make that change, has a terrible user interface, which unless you have experience dealing with all these things, you can really easily screw up. Badly done. And so that's another, these are the kinds of things you figure out slowly and through accidents in terms of running a digital state.
So we actually have two questions about identification that I would like to combine. And the first one is actually on alternative credential providers. And Crispin Ross, maybe you can go first. And then I would like to ask Riinetam to continue with your question about EU and identification. Yes. And then you will be able to answer. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. The combination makes sense. So I was just wondering that could the social media networks or big platforms that actually provide similar services, even with the two-factor authentication systems, could play actually a trust service provider role, especially maybe in the countries where the national systems are not so well developed yet.
Well, if you trust them, I would not trust, and I do not use where, you have these easy log-on things. Oh, yes, you log on via Facebook. I do not trust Facebook for anything. Sorry. I think that there is a place for trusted identity services that are strictly based on that, and that may come into use. But many of them are actually very good, but I'm not sure that governments will necessarily trust them, especially given how far we've come these days with all kinds of spoofing and everything else. Government for its own services would probably not trust something from abroad already as a sovereignty issue. Maybe in the US, you might do it if it is a US based company. But after we have seen after we saw with the SolarWinds hack that came out just recently, where the hack took place because the US was well protected against foreign hackers, but US law prevents the NSA from doing anything in the United States proper. These clever little companies that were actually fronts for Russian intelligence and Chinese intelligence, they set up their companies that basically hacked, set them up in the US. Now, I mean, it's not the same thing, but the question is, what government would trust a foreign entity to provide an identity? And I would say that certainly the Estonian government, I would probably say no government in Europe would trust a foreign entity to provide identity.
Great, so that links nicely to Trine Tam's next question. Trine, please.
Yes, my question comes from a personal frustration with the EU. My question is when we will get to an agreement within at least EU that everything should not be printed, that we can use digital reports and digital receipts and so on. Because currently, if you do any project within the EU, that means that you have to print everything out, put your signature there. I've tried to hack it by scanning my own signature and then putting it on the paper with a blue ink, sending it to them. They said, no, they need the physical paper. I need to mail it, which is not an environmental friendly either. So do you have any estimation when we will get to the point where others are also fine with dealing digital governance and so on?
Well, it actually should be illegal for them to demand that. After the ADAS directive, which is already will be 4 years old next month, or in a month and a half, they should accept a digital signature. I mean, they should. Excuse me here. I don't know what, I mean, this is, I'm going to talk about this in one of the other lectures, and I won't get into it now, but basically, look, there is only one case of a service, a governmental service working across borders today, and it only works in one direction. And that is a Finn can get a digital prescription taken out in Estonia, but an Estonian cannot do it in Finland because the Estonian system is a lot better, frankly. And that is the only one. No other digital services, public services work across borders. And that for that 1/2 of a service to work took 9 years to take place, because I proposed it to President Sauli Niinisto in, I guess, 2012. And I explained to him, and he said, great idea, let's do it. And yeah, I mean, the technical part, this is like, I always talk, the technical part of that is it's a matter of a week to set up the technology to work. It took 9 years to get the bureaucratic agreement and to get, I mean, there are a lot of problems that are all political and government. It's understandable, but that is where the slowdown is. There is no technological reason why you cannot use a digital signature for an EU document. None. But it's all legal and it's all regulatory. And when that takes place, well, go and run for the European Parliament. I mean, that's what you can do.
Fascinating question around that, because that's what we are actually doing in a research project on the once only principle for Europe, which has been keeping us up all night usually over the last 5 years. But I think we'll also get into that at a later time. I will try to summarize the other questions, because otherwise I don't think we'll get to all of them. So there is a question from Maeva Shar-Gross about when making the digital identity mandatory, how did Estonia include marginalized communities? So it's how about the inclusiveness? I will just mention all three, and then you can maybe answer them collectively. The next question was around what is actually the public value of digitization for Estonia, and to what extent do the digital initiatives add value to Estonia's public sector, by Malang Boyang. And there was another one from Maeva. Why do people trust private companies with their data more than they trust public administration?
Well, for the last questions, this was the problem I raised in the beginning. I have no understanding why you would go and spend money in a private company by giving them a credit card number, and then I would instead of the government. It's something weird, and at least in Estonia, you have to, in order to buy anything in Estonia, you can give them your credit card, but since the companies don't trust you, you have to then log on with your ID and link to your bank. So that's answering in reverse.
Yeah.
What was the second question?
Second one was about, does it actually add public value to the digitalization for the public administration? So what's the...
Well, Estonia, from Estonia, they're take different cases. Estonia basically saves 2% of GDP a year by using digital services instead of, and that's basically seen from the amount of time that government officials have to do things with paper, and again with the example I gave of the guy who designed the system, so you don't have to go from office to office in order to get the services for your newborn. That's a clear sign. I'll give you an example of what you really get. This was a huge scandal in Latvia in 2016 about the budget or the amount of money that the tax authority in Latvia took in 2015. Estonia took in 1 billion more euros, or 15% more money than Latvia. Latvia is 70% larger than Estonia in population. Its GDP per capita and GDP is 70% or maybe 60% larger. Its GDP per capita is slightly lower than Estonia, but it took in 15% less money with 70% more people. How is this possible? And the difference is that their tax board is not, their tax system is not digitized, and ours is. We employ one quarter of the number of people to do our taxes, to run the whole tax system, than Latvia did back then. Since then they've digitized, but this is a good comparison point. It's bigger than Estonia. It's the same, it's just as rich as Estonia. It takes in less money than a smaller country. And where the difference is there. They have what? We had 1,300 people working for the tax board in Estonia. Latvia had at the time 5,400 people. So 4 times as many people. They took in less money. That's the value. That's where it comes in. But on the 2% that we save, I explained that's how we get to be in NATO for free. Because we save 2% of GDP. NATO requires 2% of GDP to be spent on defense. So we save the 2% from digitization, and then that gives us 2% of GDP to spend on defense. So digitization gives us free defense.
That's a nice illustration. So we also have one about the inclusion of minorities in digitization. So how did you make sure that they are actually able to use digital means?
Well, I mean, everyone has a card. I mean, we don't make that a problem.
Only having the technology doesn't mean that you can use it, right?
I mean, if you don't know how to use it, you can go to your local, village, and they'll show you how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're, I mean, you have reduced rates for people who have problems to get an ID. Homeless people, we have very few homeless people in Estonia because I mean, our winters really take care of that. So you basically do anything you can not to be homeless. I mean, people you can't be homeless. You cannot survive. So, I mean, there are shelters and places that people go to, but So
then last, I would say we had also another question from Voter. Maybe you want to give that as a closing argument about the Google account, Voter, please.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned before that if you have websites where you can log on using Facebook, so an American private company that logs a lot of your data, you would be inclined not to do it. But these same websites often also offer the opportunity to log in with Google. In some cases, even Google linked to official university or work accounts. Would you be more prone to use this, despite the fact that the mother company, so to speak, is still an American company that logs private data? Or does this somehow change something because it is still a very different company with a slightly different approach towards data?
well, I log on to Google when I need to via my Columbia University account, since that's forever, my Columbia University account. Whereas Tartu University, when I leave Tartu University, there goes my my access. I mean, I don't like to log on to these things, but sometimes I have to. I mean, the whole issue, Google, well, I mean, there's some interesting stuff coming out about their unfair practices, but I was more offended by sort of, I remember I was in the US and I wanted to buy, I had no furniture because I had just moved there for a little while, but I needed to buy a chair, and I went and looked up chairs of a certain kind, and I bought it. I went to the store and I bought the chair. For the next 3 weeks, every time I did a Google search, I would see pictures of chairs. I mean, it just bothers me. And though I don't think, this whole, it doesn't really offend my privacy, but it offends my privacy. If you want to read about it, read this book. It's all about data scraping and how everything you do online is followed.
Sorry, did I say surveillance or data surveillance?
It's called surveillance capitalism. Data on you, And for any site, if you're in Estonia, you have to go and you have to accept or not accept cookies. I mean, I don't care. I mean, you can follow me all you want, but it is annoying. And I certainly don't want to use their services to identify myself.
Okay, I think that was a good final word. So actually, we are at the end of today's lecture. We're going to have the next one on the 14th of April, again at 10 o'clock Estonian time. And then it will be on the topic of changing nature of truth, politics, security, and war in the digital era. Anything you would like to give everyone to think until then?
Well, until about 2000, security was always kinetic. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, exists based on force defined, as it has been ever since Newton, as mass times acceleration. Acceleration is distance covered in time squared, time times time, or change in time, to be Newtonian about it. And we live, and NATO is based on that. I mean, everything else is based on that, but I mean, NATO is based on that. So that means like, how long, means how far a jet can fly without refueling, and how, tanks. And we live in an era in which mass has no meaning in the digital world. Time really has, in the size of the earth, time has no meaning. It's instantaneous. So there's no acceleration. And distance has no meaning. And suddenly we find all of these things happening, from Stuxnet to electrical shutdowns. You can basically shut down a country with no use of classical Newtonian force. That means security is completely different. That's what I will talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and invite everyone to tune in again, 14th of April, 10 o'clock Estonian time. Thank you so much, Toomas. Thank you, President Ilves. Have a good day.